In 1922, you could board a ship in London and sail for months without ever leaving British territory. A quarter of the world's population lived under the British flag. The empire was so vast that the sun literally never set on it, until it did. But how did a small island nation come to control the largest empire in human history? And more importantly, how did it lose it all? The story we're about to explore isn't just about conquest and colony. It's about innovation and tragedy, ambition and resistance, triumph and shame. It's a story that shaped our modern world in ways we're still grappling with today. Before we dive into this epic journey, I need you to imagine something. Picture modern Britain. Now multiply its size by 100. That's how vast the British Empire once was. From the freezing shores of Canada to the scorching deserts of Africa, from the bustling streets of India to the distant beaches of Australia, British influence stretched across every continent, every ocean. But to understand how this remarkable empire came to be, we need to go back, way back, to where it all began. Medieval England, a relatively insignificant kingdom on the edge of Europe. Medieval England wasn't born great. It had to fight for every inch of power it would eventually wield. And that fight began right at home. Picture this. It's 1066, and three men are claiming they should be King of England. One of them, William of Normandy, crosses the English Channel with an army that would change the course of British history forever. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just another medieval skirmish. It was the moment that connected England to continental European politics, creating a hybrid culture that would later prove crucial for empire building. But here's what most people don't realize. England's path to empire started with failure, not success. For centuries, English kings obsessed over controlling their immediate neighbors rather than distant lands. They fought the Welsh, struggled with the Scots, and repeatedly tried and failed to dominate Ireland. Take Edward the Fen, nicknamed Hammer of the Scots. He thought he had Wales and Scotland under control. He built massive castles, some of which still stand today, created an iron ring around Wales, and even stole Scotland's Stone of Destiny. But complete control, that remained frustratingly out of reach. Think of it like this. England was like a company trying to merge with its competitors before going global. And just like modern corporate mergers, these attempts at union were messy, costly, and often hostile. The real breakthrough came with the Tudor dynasty. Henry VIII's break with Rome wasn't just about his marital problems. It fundamentally changed England's position in Europe. Suddenly, England was forced to think differently about its place in the world. When his daughter Elizabeth III then took the throne, she would transform this isolation into opportunity. Imagine being Elizabeth IV, your tiny Protestant nation, surrounded by powerful Catholic kingdoms, constantly under threat. What do? You innovate. You encourage exploration. You build a navy. You create the foundations of what would become the world's most powerful maritime empire. But the real story of how England turned from isolated island to global powerhouse. That begins with a group of adventurers who dared to challenge the might of Spain on the high seas. Before we dive into those seafaring adventures, remember this. England's difficult relationship with its neighbors forced it to develop the very skills and attitudes it would later use to build its empire. Adaptability, naval power, and a knack for playing potential allies against each other. In 1577, a former slave trader turned privateer set sail from Plymouth with 5 ships. 3 years later, he'd return with just 1, but it would be laden with enough Spanish treasure to pay off England's entire foreign debt. His name? Francis Drake. And he was about to show England something revolutionary, that the oceans weren't barriers, they were highways to wealth and power. But let's back up a moment. While Spain and Portugal were busy claiming the New World, England was late to the exploration game. Really late. And it's not like they hadn't heard about all the gold and silver flowing into Spanish coffers. They had. They were just preoccupied. Here's what makes this fascinating. England's late start actually became its secret weapon. While the Spanish and Portuguese were building elaborate colonial systems, the English were learning from their mistakes, and they were getting creative, really creative. Take John Cabot, an Italian explorer sailing under the English flag. In 1497, he reached North America thinking he'd found Asia. He didn't find the riches he was looking for, but he did something possibly more valuable. He established England's first claim to North American territory. But exploration wasn't just about discovery, it was about survival. When Elizabeth I took the throne, England was surrounded by hostile Catholic powers. The solution? Send privateers, basically licensed pirates, to raid Spanish treasure ships. Imagine being one of these early explorers. No GPS, no reliable maps, no radio communication. Just you, a wooden ship, and the vast unknown ocean. The mortality rate on these voyages was staggering, yet men lined up to join them. And then there was Sir Walter Raleigh, courtier, poet, explorer, and the man behind the first English attempts to colonize America. His Roanoke colony might have become the mysterious lost colony, but it set a template for future English settlements. The defining moment came in 1588 with the Spanish Armada. Spain's mighty fleet sailed to invade England, and against all odds, they lost. Not just lost, they were demolished. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a complete shift in the balance of power. But here's what really changed everything. England realized that the real profit wasn't in finding gold or silver, it was in trade. And that realization would lead to the creation of something that would change the world, the Joint Stock Company. Speaking of which, have you ever wondered how a small group of merchants ended up controlling an entire subcontinent? Because that's exactly what happened when England's most powerful company was born. On December 31st, 1600, a group of 125 London merchants gathered in a small room. What they created that day wasn't just a company, it was an empire in waiting. The East India Company would go on to command an army twice the size of Britain's, rule over 400 million people, and generate revenues worth trillions in today's money. Not bad for a startup, right? Think of these joint stock companies like the tech giants of their day. Just as Amazon started with books and now shapes our entire world, these companies started with simple trade missions and ended up ruling vast territories. The difference? These companies had their own armies. But what made joint stock companies so revolutionary? Simple. They solved the biggest problem of colonial expansion: risk. Instead of one merchant risking everything on a single voyage, hundreds of investors could buy shares, spreading both the risk and the potential rewards. Take the East India Company's first voyage. It took nearly 2 years, lost half its crew, but returned with enough spices to generate a 700% profit. 700%. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the action. And it wasn't just the East India Company. The Hudson's Bay Company claimed most of modern Canada. The Royal African Company controlled the slave trade. The Virginia Company established the first permanent English settlement in America. These weren't just businesses. They were the engines of empire. But here's where it gets interesting and disturbing. These companies had almost unlimited power in their territories. They could mint money, raise armies, make laws, and wage war. Imagine if Microsoft could legally declare war on Apple. That's basically what we're talking about. For the people living under company rule, this was no abstract business arrangement. The East India Company's policies led to devastating famines in Bengal. Their pursuit of profit reshaped entire societies. When we talk about corporate responsibility today, it's worth remembering these historical lessons. The real genius of the joint stock system wasn't just financial, it was political. These companies did the expensive, risky work of establishing colonies, while the crown reaped the benefits of expanded territory and influence. It was empire building on the cheap. And here's the clever part. When a company became too powerful or problematic, the crown could step in, take over, and look like the hero. That's exactly what happened after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, when the British government assumed direct control of India. But managing an empire isn't just about having the right business model. You need systems, structures, and different ways to control different territories, and that's where things get really complicated. Picture trying to manage a global corporation where every branch operates differently. Some are franchises, others are directly owned, and some are just loosely affiliated partners. Now, multiply that complexity by 1,000, add in different cultures, languages, and rebellions, and you'll start to understand how the British Empire actually worked, or sometimes didn't. Here's something that might surprise you. There was never a single British Empire. Instead, there was a patchwork of different colonial systems, each designed to solve specific problems or exploit specific opportunities. It was less like a uniform empire and more like a complex web of different arrangements. Let's break down the three main types of colonies. First, crown colonies, directly ruled by the British government. Think of India after 1857. The crown appointed governors, made laws, and controlled everything from taxes to defense. Jamaica became a crown colony after a series of slave rebellions convinced Britain that local planters couldn't be trusted to maintain order. It's like when corporate headquarters takes over a troubled franchise, except with far more serious consequences. Then you had charter colonies, run by those joint stock companies we just talked about. They had their own rules, their own courts, and sometimes their own armies. Massachusetts started this way, under the Massachusetts Bay Company. But here's where it gets fascinating. Some charter colonies were so independent they basically functioned like mini-republics. Connecticut and Rhode Island were so autonomous they kept their colonial charters even after American independence. Finally, there were proprietary colonies, basically given to individuals who owned them like personal estates. Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Carolina all started this way. Imagine being William Penn and literally owning Pennsylvania. Talk about a real estate portfolio. This variety wasn't just random, it was strategically brilliant. Different colonial structures meant Britain could adapt its control methods to local conditions. It's like having different tools in a toolbox. You don't use a hammer when you need a screwdriver. But this flexibility came with a price. Different colonies developed different expectations about their relationship with Britain. Some saw themselves as practically independent, others as mere extensions of British power. These contradictions would eventually help spark the American Revolution. For the colonized peoples, these different structures could mean dramatically different lives. Your rights, your opportunities, even your basic freedoms could depend entirely on which type of colony you lived in. Take the Ulster Plantation model. It was so successful, from the British perspective, that it became a blueprint for colonization elsewhere. And that brings us to our next crucial chapter. Because if you want to understand how Britain really built its empire, you need to understand what happened in Ireland first. The Ulster Plantation wasn't just another colony. It was the laboratory where Britain perfected its colonization techniques. If you want to understand how Britain built the largest empire in history, don't start in India, don't start in America, start in Northern Ireland. Because what happened there in the early 1600s would create a template that would reshape continents and affect millions of lives for centuries to come. The year is 1607. England has a problem. Ireland, particularly Ulster, keeps resisting English rule. The solution? A radical experiment in social engineering that would become known as the Ulster Plantation. Think of it like this. Imagine if a foreign power decided to completely reshape your community by bringing in thousands of loyal settlers, giving them the best land, and creating an entirely new social and economic system. That's exactly what happened in Ulster. The plan was deceptively simple, but brutally effective. Confiscate land from Irish Catholics, bring in Protestant settlers from England and Scotland, and create a loyal population that would secure British control. But this wasn't just about population transfer, it was about complete cultural transformation. The numbers are staggering. Over 80,000 English and Scottish settlers arrived between 1607 and 1620. Irish Catholics were pushed to the margins, banned from living in certain areas, and forbidden from marrying the newcomers. It was social engineering on an industrial scale. Imagine being told that not only is your land no longer yours, but you can't even live in the new towns being built on it. The psychological impact was devastating and intentional. This wasn't just about taking control, it was about breaking the spirit of resistance. But here's what makes the Ulster Plantation so crucial to understanding the British Empire. It established key principles that would be repeated worldwide: strategic settlement of loyal populations, creation of privileged minority communities, use of legal systems to enforce social hierarchies, economic transformation through new property relations, cultural suppression of native populations. The success of this model, and I use that term knowing how controversial it is, convinced British authorities they had found the perfect formula for colonial control. But they failed to recognize that they were also planting the seeds of centuries of conflict. You can see echoes of the Ulster model everywhere in the later British Empire, in the American colonies, in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa. Each time, the basic blueprint remained the same, even if the details changed. The plantation model proved so effective at establishing control that it became the go-to solution for colonial expansion. But it came with a terrible cost: deeply divided societies, generational conflicts, and tensions that persist to this day. The legacy of Ulster didn't just reshape Ireland, it provided Britain with a colonial playbook that would be used to reshape the world. And that world reshaping would be driven by something even more powerful than military might: economic power. Because while the Ulster Plantation showed how to control territory, the real engine of empire was about to kick into high gear. It was time for Britain to perfect an economic system that would dominate global trade for centuries. In 1651, England passed a law that would change the world. The Navigation Acts seemed simple on paper. All colonial trade had to use English ships with English crews. But this wasn't just a shipping regulation. It was the beginning of the most sophisticated economic system the world had ever seen. Think of it like building the world's first Walmart, but instead of controlling retail, you're controlling entire oceans. The British Empire wasn't just about planting flags, it was about creating the world's first truly global economic network. Welcome to Mercantilism, the economic theory that powered an empire. The basic idea: colonies exist to enrich the mother country, period. It's like having a series of company stores where all the profits flow back to headquarters. Picture this: raw cotton from India, processed in Manchester's mills, turned into textiles, then sold back to India at a premium. Meanwhile, Indian weavers are put out of business. It's a perfect system, if you're British. The system worked on 3 simple rules. Colonies could only trade with Britain or other British colonies. High-value manufacturing stayed in Britain. The colonies provided raw materials and served as markets for British goods. But here's what makes this fascinating. Britain didn't just create an economic system, they created an addiction. Colonial economies became so dependent on British trade that breaking away became almost impossible. And the numbers were staggering. By 1700, Britain's colonial trade had grown by 1,600% compared to 1600. But this wealth came at a price, and not just for the colonies. For colonial subjects, this system was suffocating. Imagine being a skilled craftsperson in India, watching your traditional industry die because British laws forbid you from competing. Or being an American merchant, forced to sell your goods at below-market prices to British traders. Here's something rarely discussed. This system actually hurt many British consumers too. They paid higher prices for sugar, tobacco, and other colonial goods because of monopoly controls. But the profits for merchants and manufacturers? Astronomical. The sophistication of this system was remarkable. Complex banking networks, insurance markets, standardized shipping practices, sophisticated credit systems, worldwide commodity markets. The system reached its peak in the late 1700s. Britain had created something unprecedented, a global economic machine that transferred wealth from the periphery to the center with ruthless efficiency. But here's the irony. This very success contained the seeds of rebellion. The American Revolution wasn't just about taxation, it was about breaking free from this economic straitjacket. And speaking of colonies, nowhere was this economic system more profitable or more devastating than in the Caribbean and North America, where three commodities would reshape the world: sugar, tobacco, and human lives. A pound of sugar in 1650 London cost the equivalent of $45 in today's money. By 1800, it cost less than $2. Behind this price drop lies one of humanity's greatest tragedies, a story of wealth, exploitation, and human suffering on an unprecedented scale. Let's be absolutely clear, what we're about to discuss isn't just economic history. It's the story of how the pursuit of profit created a system so inhumane that its effects still haunt us today. The British Caribbean and North American colonies operated like two gears in the same machine. Each had its cash crops, sugar in the Caribbean, tobacco in Virginia, but both ran on the same horrific fuel: enslaved labor. Take Barbados. In 1640, it was a relatively insignificant colony. Within 30 years, it became the most valuable piece of real estate in the British Empire. The secret: sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans. The human cost was staggering. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation was just 7 years. Imagine working 18-hour days in the scorching Caribbean sun, knowing your life would likely end before you'd been there a decade. The profits were astronomical. A successful sugar plantation could pay for itself in just 3 years. Caribbean planters became so wealthy, they sent their children to Britain's finest schools and bought seats in Parliament. Meanwhile, in North America, tobacco was king. Virginia planters like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson built their fortunes on this golden leaf. But like sugar, tobacco required intensive labor. The solution was the same: human trafficking on an industrial scale. The numbers are mind-numbing. Over 3.1 million Africans transported by British ships. Mortality rates of 15 to 25% during the Atlantic crossing. By 1750, enslaved people outnumbered whites in many colonies. Insurance companies in London specifically covered slave ship voyages. Here's what makes this system particularly diabolical: it created a triangular trade. British ships carried manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and colonial products back to Britain. Each leg generated profit, but behind these cold statistics were real people. People with names, families, hopes, and dreams, all erased by a system that saw them as mere commodities. The psychological trauma of this system echoes through generations. Yet wherever there was oppression, there was resistance. From the Maroons in Jamaica to numerous plantation rebellions, enslaved people constantly fought against their bondage. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a continuous struggle for freedom. The wealth generated during this period didn't just enrich individual planters, it helped finance Britain's industrial revolution. Many of Britain's great cities, banks and insurance companies were built on profits from this trade. By the late 1700s, this system seemed unshakable, but changes were coming, changes that would reshape not just these colonies, but the entire concept of empire. But before we get to those changes, we need to understand another crucial development: how England and Scotland united to create a new power, Great Britain. Because without this union, the empire as we know it might never have existed. On May 1st, 1707, two ancient enemies became one nation. It wasn't a marriage of love, it was a marriage of convenience. But like many such marriages, it would prove more successful than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of how England and Scotland created Great Britain, and in doing so, laid the foundation for the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But here's what most people don't know. This union wasn't born from strength. It was born from disaster. Scotland had just suffered the biggest financial catastrophe in its history, and England was desperately worried about its northern border's security. Let's rewind to the 1690s. Scotland attempted something incredibly ambitious, establishing its own colony in Panama. The Darien scheme wasn't just a failure, it was a catastrophe that wiped out nearly a quarter of Scotland's liquid capital. Imagine your entire nation investing in what they believe is a guaranteed path to prosperity, only to watch it all collapse. The psychological impact on Scotland was devastating. Many Scots felt they had no choice but to consider a union they'd previously rejected. Enter England with an offer, full access to English markets and colonies, plus a financial bailout. The price, Scottish independence. It was an offer Scotland couldn't refuse, though many tried to. The streets of Edinburgh erupted in protest. One observer wrote, "For every Scot in favour of the union, there were 99 against. Yet the Scottish Parliament voted for it anyway. Why? Follow the money." The Acts of Union created something unprecedented, a single parliament. Unified customs and trade systems, shared currency, combined military forces, but separate legal and religious systems. Here's the fascinating part. What started as a reluctant partnership became one of the most powerful alliances in history. Scottish entrepreneurs, soldiers, and administrators would become crucial to building and running the empire. Within a generation, Scots were everywhere in the empire, running the East India Company, governing colonies, leading military campaigns, establishing trading networks, founding banks. The very people who had protested against union with England became some of the empire's most enthusiastic builders. As one historian put it, the Scots became more British than the English. But this wasn't just about politics and economics. The union created a new identity, British, that would prove remarkably flexible and inclusive, at least for white Protestants. It was like creating a new brand that both sides could buy into. The combined resources of England and Scotland created a powerhouse: Scottish banking expertise, English capital, combined naval power, shared imperial ambitions, united diplomatic front. This union would prove crucial in coming century. As Britain faced off against its European rivals, without Scottish manpower and expertise, the British Empire might never have reached its extraordinary scale, and that scale was about to be tested as Britain entered an era of almost continuous warfare. The 18th century would see Britain transform from a significant European power into the world's dominant empire. But first, they had to win a series of global conflicts that would reshape the world map. Between 1700 and 1800, Britain fought 6 major wars, lasting a total of 43 years. That's nearly half a century of constant conflict. But these weren't just wars. They were the world's first truly global conflicts, fought across oceans and continents. And when the smoke cleared, Britain emerged as the world's undisputed superpower. Think of it like a global chess game, but with real ships, soldiers, and territory at stake. While other European powers focused on winning battles, Britain focused on control. Let's start with the War of Spanish Succession, 1701-1714. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, small territories with massive strategic value. It's like controlling the world's busiest shipping lanes with just 2 pieces on the board. But the real game changer was the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. This was literally the First World War, fought in Europe, North America, India, and the high seas. And Britain played it masterfully. Picture this. While French armies won victories in Europe, British forces were systematically dismantling French power everywhere else. Quebec fell, French India crumbled, the Caribbean colonies changed hands. It was a complete transformation of the global power structure. Here's what made Britain's strategy brilliant. They understood that controlling the seas was more important than controlling land. While France focused on European battlefields, Britain focused on strategic ports and trading posts. Britain's success wasn't just about military power. They revolutionized warfare through naval innovations and financial systems, including war bonds, strategic alliances, colonial recruitment, and superior logistics. This powerful combination set the stage for Britain to become the era's dominant empire. For British soldiers and sailors, these wars were brutal. Disease killed more men than combat. Ships could be at sea for years. Colonial troops faced wilderness warfare unlike anything seen before, yet they persevered. By 1763, Britain had become the world's dominant power. But here's the twist. They achieved this while having one of Europe's smallest standing armies. Their real strength was the Royal Navy and their ability to finance long wars. The American Revolution would later challenge this supremacy, but even losing the 13 colonies couldn't stop Britain's rise. Why? Because they'd already built something more valuable, a global network of naval bases and trading posts. Britain's success relied on three key factors: naval supremacy, the wooden walls of England; financial power, the Bank of England and war financing; strategic flexibility, adapting tactics to local conditions. For colonial populations, these wars brought massive changes. Indigenous peoples found themselves caught between European powers. Local rulers had to choose sides. Entire populations were displaced. The maps we use today were essentially drawn during this period. Cities like Mumbai, Singapore, and Hong Kong became global powers because of decisions made in these conflicts. But success came with a price. Britain's victories created an empire so vast it became increasingly difficult to control. And nowhere would this become more apparent than in their most developed colonies, the American ones. Because the same military and economic might that built the empire was about to face its greatest challenge, not from foreign powers, but from Britain's own colonial children. On July 4, 1776, Britain didn't just lose 13 colonies. It lost its way of thinking about empire forever. The American Revolution wasn't just a military defeat. It was an ideological earthquake that forced Britain to completely reimagine how it ruled its empire. Here's what makes this fascinating. Britain was actually at the height of its power when the revolution began. They'd just won the 7 Years' War, dominated global trade, and had the world's strongest navy. So what went wrong? The seeds of revolution were planted in Britain's very success. After 1763, they faced a problem: how to pay for their expensive victory in the 7 Years' War. Their solution? Tax the colonies. It seemed logical. After all, the war had been fought partly to protect them. But here's the crucial mistake. Britain had spent decades allowing the colonies to largely govern themselves. Now, suddenly, they wanted to assert control. Imagine giving your teenage children freedom for years, then abruptly trying to enforce strict rules. It wasn't going to end well. The escalation was rapid. 1764, Sugar Act; 1765, Stamp Act and colonial outrage; 1767, Townshend Acts; 1770, Boston Massacre; 1773, Boston Tea Party; 1774, Intolerable Acts. But taxes weren't the real issue. The colonial slogan wasn't "no taxes," it was no taxation without representation. This was about political rights, not just money. Imagine the confusion and betrayal on both sides. British officials couldn't understand why colonists who paid far lower taxes than people in Britain were complaining. Colonists couldn't understand why the mother country wouldn't grant them the rights of Englishmen they'd always claimed. The war itself was a military nightmare for Britain. They had to fight 3,000 miles from home, in hostile terrain, against people who knew the land intimately. And worse, their enemies were technically their own citizens. Few people realize, More German soldiers fought for Britain than British ones. France spent itself into bankruptcy helping America. Many Native American tribes sided with Britain. The war nearly bankrupted both sides. The revolution's impact rippled worldwide. France's support led to its own revolution. Spain and Netherlands saw opportunity to challenge British power. Colonial populations everywhere watched and learned. Britain had to rethink its entire imperial strategy. But here's the most profound impact. Britain learned from this disaster. The loss of America led to more flexible colonial administration, greater autonomy for white settler colonies, focus on indirect control where possible, emphasis on naval power over land control. Britain didn't just lose America, it gained a new understanding of empire. Perhaps the greatest irony, Britain and America would eventually become the closest of allies, creating a relationship that would shape the 20th century. But first, Britain had to find new horizons for its imperial ambitions. With America gone, they turned their eyes to new opportunities in the East and South. The loss of 13 colonies was about to accelerate the expansion of British power into entirely new territories. When Captain Arthur Phillip sailed into Botany Bay in 1788, he wasn't just founding a prison colony, he was launching Britain's Second Empire. The loss of America had forced Britain to look elsewhere, and what they found would transform the empire from an Atlantic power into a truly global force. Britain faced an immediate crisis after losing America, where to send its convicts. The American colonies had previously absorbed about 1,000 British criminals each year. Now those prison ships were overcrowded, and Britain needed a solution. Their answer would reshape the world map. The journey to Australia was unprecedented. 11 ships carrying 1,500 people sailed for 8 months through largely uncharted waters. When they arrived, they found not the paradise James Cook had described, but a harsh, unforgiving land. Yet from this desperate beginning, a new kind of colony would emerge. Consider the human drama. Convicts torn from their families, Marines tasked with guarding them, and Aboriginal peoples watching in bewilderment as pale strangers claimed their ancient lands. The first years were brutal. Starvation, disease, and despair were constant companions. But Australia was just the beginning. Britain's naval power allowed them to systematically explore and claim vast swathes of the Pacific. New Zealand, Pacific Islands, and numerous strategic ports fell under British influence. It was like placing pieces on a giant chessboard, each move calculated to extend British power. Meanwhile, in Asia, the East India Company was transforming from a trading enterprise into a territorial power. The company's victory at Plassey in 1757 had already given them control of Bengal. Now, they began pushing deeper into India, using a combination of military might and diplomatic manipulation. What made this new direction so successful was its diversity of approach. In Australia, they built settler colonies. In India, they ruled through existing power structures. In the Pacific, they established strategic bases and trading posts. Each region required different tactics, and Britain proved remarkably adaptable. This wasn't just geographical expansion, it was a fundamental shift in how Britain saw its empire. The focus moved from agricultural colonies to strategic control of trade routes. Singapore, founded in 1819, exemplified this new thinking, a tiny island that became crucial for controlling Asian trade. For indigenous peoples, this expansion was catastrophic. Aboriginal Australians, Maori in New Zealand, and countless Pacific Islanders saw their worlds upended. Traditional ways of life collapsed in the face of British settlement and influence. Yet this new direction proved incredibly profitable. Australian wool, Indian cotton, Pacific trade routes, each added new dimensions to British economic power. The loss of America had forced Britain to innovate, and that innovation paid off spectacularly. But as Britain expanded into these new territories, a different kind of challenge was brewing back in Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte was rising to power, and he had plans that would test Britain's new global empire to its very limits. In 1805, off the coast of Spain, Admiral Nelson sent a simple flag signal to his fleet. England expects that every man will do his duty. Hours later, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Britain would secure its position as the world's undisputed naval superpower for the next century. But the path to this moment was anything but simple. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power in France, he represented Britain's worst nightmare, a military genius who could unite continental Europe under French control. The British faced a stark choice: fight or accept French dominance. They chose to fight, and that decision would reshape the world. What most people don't realize is that Britain's greatest weapon against Napoleon wasn't its navy or its army, it was its banking system. While France struggled to finance its wars, Britain's modern financial institutions could sustain years of conflict. Money, not muskets, would ultimately determine the victor. The war wasn't just fought in Europe. From the Caribbean to India, British and French forces clashed. But Britain's naval superiority meant they could strike anywhere while protecting their trade routes. It was like having a force field around their entire empire while still being able to punch through the enemy's defenses. When Napoleon attempted to strangle British trade through his continental system, Britain responded by seizing French and neutral ships, capturing enemy colonies, and opening new markets. They even conducted history's first amphibious invasion of a European capital, Copenhagen, to prevent Danish ships from falling into French hands. For ordinary British citizens, these were years of both pride and hardship. Taxes soared, food prices rose, and press gangs roamed ports looking for sailors. Yet there was also a profound sense of national purpose. Britain stood alone against a continental tyrant. The wars taught Britain crucial lessons about power. They learned to fight through allies while maintaining control of the seas. This indirect approach would become their standard strategy, using naval power and economic strength rather than large land armies. By 1815, Britain emerged as the world's premier power. They gained Malta, Ceylon, Cape Colony, Trinidad, and other strategic territories. But more importantly, they gained something priceless: a century of naval supremacy and industrial dominance. The wars accelerated Britain's industrial revolution. Unable to trade with Europe, they were forced to develop new industries and markets. When peace came, these advantages helped Britain surge ahead of its competitors. With Europe exhausted by war, Britain had a free hand to expand its empire. No other power could challenge them at sea, and their industrial base gave them unprecedented economic power. The stage was set for what historians would later call Britain's imperial century. But this newfound power brought new responsibilities and challenges. As Britain turned its attention to India and Africa, they would face questions that would define the empire's future. How do you control such vast territories? How do you justify ruling over millions of people who never asked for British governance? The answers to these questions would shape the next phase of British imperial expansion as the empire reached for what seemed like unlimited power. In 1876, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. It was more than just a new title. It was a statement to the world. Britain now ruled over 1/5 of the global population, including the richest territory in Asia. But commanding an empire of this scale would prove to be as challenging as acquiring it. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British government took direct control from the East India Company. This wasn't just an administrative change, it was a complete transformation in how Britain approached imperial rule. The old commercial empire was becoming something new, a civilizing mission, or so they claimed. But here's what's fascinating. While the British portrayed themselves as bringing order to India, they were actually building their administration on existing Mughal systems. They weren't so much replacing Indian institutions as adapting them for their own purposes. The famous British bureaucracy in India was actually an Anglo-Indian hybrid. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, Britain and Russia were engaged in a decades-long shadow war, the Great Game. This wasn't about territory, it was about influence. Every mountain pass, every desert oasis, every tribal alliance could tip the balance of power. British officers disguised as holy men crossed the Himalayas, while Russian agents stirred trouble on India's frontiers. The scramble for Africa began almost by accident. British involvement started with small coastal trading posts, but by the 1880s, it had turned into a mad dash for territory. European powers drew lines on maps, dividing up a continent with ruler-straight borders that ignored ethnic and geographic realities, borders that still cause conflicts today. For the people living under British rule, this period brought profound changes. Traditional rulers found themselves serving as British puppets. Ancient customs were outlawed as uncivilized. Children were sent to English-style schools to become proper British subjects. The human cost of this cultural transformation was immense. The telegraph and steam engine shrank the empire. Suddenly, orders from London could reach India in minutes, not months. Steamships could transport troops anywhere in the empire within weeks. This wasn't just convenient. It fundamentally changed how power could be exercised across vast distances. But imperial rule faced constant challenges. In India, educated Indians began demanding equal rights. In Africa, resistance to British expansion was fierce. The Zulu War and the Boer War showed the limits of British power. The empire had to constantly adapt, negotiating between force and compromise. India became the empire's economic engine. Its markets, resources, and manpower fueled British industry. But this relationship was deeply unequal. India's traditional industries were deliberately destroyed to create markets for British goods. The country that had once produced the world's finest textiles was reduced to supplying raw cotton to Manchester's mills. This was also when the idea of empire reached its cultural peak in Britain. Stories of imperial adventure filled boys' magazines. Products from across the empire filled British homes. The empire wasn't just a political reality, it had become part of British identity. But beneath this imperial confidence, new challenges were emerging. Education and exposure to Western ideas were creating new forms of nationalism in the colonies. The cost of maintaining such a vast empire was straining even Britain's resources. And in Europe, new powers were rising that would soon challenge British dominance. The 20th century would bring challenges that would test the empire like never before. In 1914, the British Empire covered a quarter of the world's land surface and ruled over 413 million people. By 1997, when Hong Kong was returned to China, that empire had virtually disappeared. The story of how this happened is not just about decline, it's about how global events can transform even the mightiest of empires into memory. The First World War seemed like a demonstration of imperial power. Troops from India, Australia, Canada, and Africa fought for Britain. But the war exposed deep cracks in the imperial facade. The cost was staggering, not just in lives and money, but in Britain's global standing. The empire had won the war, but lost its aura of invincibility. The 1920s and 30s brought new challenges. India's independence movement, led by Gandhi, showed how non-violent resistance could challenge imperial power more effectively than armed rebellion. The 1931 Statute of Westminster gave dominions like Canada and Australia nearly complete autonomy. The empire was evolving into something more voluntary, the Commonwealth. Then came 1939. Again, the empire rallied to Britain's defense. But this time was different. Singapore's fall to Japan in 1942 shattered the myth of British military supremacy in Asia. Indian nationalist leaders asked a pointed question: how could Britain fight for freedom in Europe while denying it to its colonies? Here's the irony. Britain emerged victorious from World War II, but the war itself made the empire unsustainable. Britain was exhausted, nearly bankrupt, and facing a new world order dominated by the United States and Soviet Union, both powers officially opposed to colonialism. India's independence in 1947 opened the floodgates. The partition of India and Pakistan showed how messy imperial withdrawal could be. Millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead. But there was no going back. Within a generation, most of Britain's African colonies would also gain independence. For many British people, this rapid dissolution was bewildering. The empire had been part of their national identity for centuries. For the colonized peoples, independence brought both joy and challenges. New nations had to build themselves up while dealing with artificial borders and divided societies, legacies of imperial rule. The 1956 Suez Crisis crystallized Britain's new position in the world. When Britain tried to seize the Suez Canal, American opposition forced a humiliating withdrawal. The message was clear: Britain was no longer a superpower that could act independently. By 1960, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan spoke of the wind of change blowing through Africa. The empire was transforming into the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations. It wasn't the end Britain had planned, but it was perhaps the best possible outcome. The return of Hong Kong to China in 1997 marked the symbolic end of the British Empire. The handover ceremony was dignified, but it represented something profound: the final act of the largest empire in human history. Yet the empire didn't simply vanish. Its legacy lives on in language, law, education, and international relations. The Commonwealth continues. London remains a global financial centre. Former colonies maintain deep connections with Britain, though not always comfortable ones. But to truly understand how Britain managed to control such a vast empire for so long, we need to look at one crucial factor that made it all possible: technology. When the first submarine telegraph cable connected London to Bombay in 1870, the time to send a message dropped from 6 weeks to just 4 minutes. In that moment, the nature of empire changed forever. Technology didn't just support the British Empire, it made it possible. The story begins with ships. The British didn't just build more ships than anyone else, they built better ones. The development of the copper-bottomed hull meant British vessels could stay at sea longer than their rivals. When steam power arrived, Britain's industrial might turned this new technology into imperial advantage. But it was the telegraph that truly transformed empire management. Picture this. Before the telegraph, a governor in India might wait months to receive instructions from London. By the 1870s, the colonial office could send orders and receive responses in a single day. Here's what's fascinating. The same telegraph network that helped Britain control its empire also made it vulnerable. When Indian nationalists learned to tap into these communication networks, they could coordinate resistance across the subcontinent. Technology was a double-edged sword. The technological gap between British forces and indigenous peoples was often decisive. The Maxim gun, introduced in the 1880s, could fire 600 rounds per minute. Against traditionally armed warriors, it was devastatingly effective. But this superiority created a moral dilemma that haunts discussions of empire to this day. Britain's Industrial Revolution became the empire's secret weapon. They could produce more ships, guns, and ammunition than any rival. But more importantly, they could produce consumer goods that created new markets and dependencies. Quinine was perhaps the empire's most important drug. By allowing Europeans to survive in malarial regions, it opened up vast areas of Africa and Asia to colonial rule. Medical technology became a tool of empire, but it also brought genuine benefits to colonial populations. Railway lines snaked across India, Africa, and other colonies like steel threads, binding the empire together. They moved troops, transported goods, and reshaped societies. But they also connected people and ideas in ways the British couldn't control. Technology didn't just change how the empire was run, it changed how people thought about it. Photography brought images of distant colonies into British homes. Steamships made imperial tourism possible. The printing press and expanding literacy created new challenges. As colonial subjects gained access to education and technology, they began questioning imperial rule. The same tools that helped build the empire would ultimately help dismantle it. But as we reach the end of our journey through the British Empire's history, we must ask, what did all this technological innovation, territorial expansion, and cultural exchange leave us? What is the true legacy of history's largest empire? The British Empire ended, but it never really went away. Its fingerprints are everywhere, in the language you speak, the borders you cross, the laws you follow, and even the side of the road you drive on. English is now the global language of business, diplomacy, and the internet. The British didn't plan this. They couldn't have imagined the internet, but their empire created the foundation for English to become the world's first truly global language. Parliamentary democracy, common law, civil service systems, these British institutions now operate far beyond the empire's old borders. India, the world's largest democracy, runs on a political system that evolved from its colonial past. Consider something seemingly simple: time zones. When you check your watch, you're using a system developed to coordinate British imperial railways. Greenwich Mean Time became the global standard not because it was scientifically special, but because Britain ruled the waves and the maps. Arbitrary borders drawn in London created conflicts that still rage today. The partition of India led to one of history's largest mass migrations and countless deaths. Exploitative economic policies stunted development in many regions. Cricket spreading from English villages to become India's national passion. Tea, originally Chinese, becoming Britain's national drink via Indian plantations. Curry houses becoming as British as fish and chips. Today, the empire sparks fierce debates about historical memory, reparations, and responsibility. Should museums return artifacts taken during colonial times? How should imperial history be taught? The Commonwealth of Nations represents perhaps the empire's most positive legacy, a voluntary association of independent states. But even this raises questions. Can former colonies and their one-time ruler truly meet as equals? As we face global challenges like climate change, economic inequality, and technological disruption, the imperial legacy matters more than ever. Understanding how the empire shaped our world helps us understand why international cooperation is both vital and complicated. The British Empire was neither the unalloyed good its defenders claim, nor the pure evil its critics describe. It was perhaps the most transformative force in modern history, for better and worse. Its true legacy isn't just in what it built or destroyed, but in how it fundamentally changed how humans organize themselves and think about the world. As we close this journey through imperial history, remember this: the British Empire may be gone, but we all live in the world it made. Understanding its legacy isn't just about the past. It's about understanding ourselves, our present challenges, and our possible futures. The empire ended, but the story continues. And in many ways, we're still writing its final chapters. From a small island nation to ruler of a quarter of the world's land and population, and back again, the story of the British Empire is really the story of how our modern world was shaped. Its rise defined the 18th and 19th centuries, its fall transformed the 20th, and its legacy continues to influence the 21st. The institutions we trust, the conflicts we face, the languages we speak, and the maps we use all bear the imprint of this remarkable historical phenomenon. For better or worse, the British Empire connected the world in ways that had never been possible before. Some will see it as a story of progress and civilization. Others will view it as a cautionary tale of power, exploitation, and human cost. As we face our own global challenges, from climate change to economic inequality, from technological revolution to cultural conflicts, the lessons of the British Empire remain startlingly relevant. How do different peoples live together? How do we balance progress with tradition? The sun may have set on the British Empire, but its dawn created the world we inhabit today. Understanding this history isn't just about looking backward. It's about understanding who we are, how we got here, and perhaps most importantly, where we might be going. Because while empires may rise and fall, their legacies echo through time. And in those echoes, we might just find the wisdom to face our own future challenges. And remember, as always, the best way to understand the present is to learn from the past. Remember to ring that notification bell, because next week we're exploring another incredible story that most history books won't tell you about. This is Bites of Goats, where we don't just talk about history, we learn from it. See you in the next one.